The laughter stopped the entire saloon. Every head turned. Every glass paused mid-raise. Even the piano player's fingers stumbled on the keys, producing a discordant clang that rang out and then died into absolute silence. Because the sound was so unexpected, so raw, so entirely out of place on the lips of Petra Raines that the 40-odd souls crammed into the Dusty Creek Saloon on that sweltering July evening in 1882 simply could not process it. Weston Tanner stood frozen with a tin mug halfway to his mouth, watching her laugh, and something happened inside his chest that he had no words for and no map to navigate. It was a sound like water breaking through a dam that had held for too long, like something terribly important being restored to its rightful place in the world. Then he saw her face change. The moment she realized people were staring, the laughter died. Not gradually, not politely, but extinguished, like a candle pinched between two wet fingers. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went flat and careful and distant. She turned her face toward the window, and the woman who had laughed was gone so completely, it was as though she had never existed at all. Weston set his mug down. He did not pick it up again that night, because he had seen something in those 3 seconds that changed everything. He had seen who Petra Raines actually was before whatever had broken her had done its work, before the grief and the secrets and the dark past had carved her face into the careful, guarded mask she wore every single day. He had seen her true face, bright and unguarded and heartbreakingly alive. And standing there in the dust and noise and tobacco smoke of that saloon, Weston Tanner made a decision he did not fully understand yet, but that settled into him the way a fence post settles into the earth after you've driven it deep enough. Fixed. Immovable. He was never going to leave her. He did not know her yet, not truly. He did not know about the dead husband or the burned letters or the land claim that 3 different men had tried to steal from under her. He did not know about the forced choice she had made 4 years ago that had cost her everything, or the hidden motive behind the banker's sudden friendliness toward her, or the trap that was even then being set with her name on it. He knew only that she had laughed for the first time in years, and that he had been lucky enough to hear it, and that the world was a more bearable place with that sound in it. He needed to understand how they had arrived at this moment. It had started the way most things in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, started in the summer of 1882. With dust and heat and trouble rolling in from the south. Weston Tanner had ridden into town 3 weeks earlier on a gray, dappled horse named Fletcher, leading a pack mule loaded with his tools and his savings, and the deed to 40 acres he had purchased sight unseen from a land agent in Santa Fe. He was 29 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of ranch work in Texas, with dark hair gone a little too long at the collar, and eyes the color of creek water in September, that particular shade between green and brown that could go either way depending on the light. He had come to Dusty Creek to build something of his own. He had worked other men's land since he was 16, had sweated and bled and given the best years of his youth to ranches owned by men who put their names on deeds and their boots on their desks, while Weston drove their cattle and mended their fences and asked for nothing beyond his wages. He was done with that. He had his 40 acres. He had his tools. He had his plan. What he had not planned on was Petra Raines. The first time he saw her was not in the saloon. It was at the land registry office, a narrow, overheated room above the general store where a sweating clerk named Ogden kept records with the enthusiasm of a man who had already made peace with dying in that chair. Weston was there to register his deed. Petra was there to defend hers. She stood at the counter in a dark blue dress that had been mended at the cuffs and pressed with great care, her dark hair coiled at the back of her neck. Her chin elevated at an angle that suggested she had long ago decided the best defense was to give nobody the satisfaction of seeing her uncertain. She was 26 years old, though she carried herself with the weary precision of someone who had compressed about 15 years of hard living into that age. Her face was fine-boned and lovely in a way that seemed entirely beside the point to her, as though beauty were simply an attribute she happened to have, and found somewhat inconvenient. She was arguing with a man named Gerald Prout. Prout was the kind of man the West produced in abundance and the decent parts of humanity could have done without. He was in his mid-40s, soft around the middle but not soft in his intentions, with a banker's careful smile and a rancher's contempt for anyone he considered beneath him. He ran Dusty Creek's only bank and had recently decided that the 300 acres that adjoined his own land to the west, the 300 acres that happened to belong to Petra Raines, would suit him considerably better in his own possession. Mrs. Raines, Prout was saying when Weston pushed open the creaking door, I am simply suggesting that a woman in your circumstances, managing that land alone, might find a generous offer worthy of consideration. My circumstances are my own business, Petra said. Her voice was controlled, precise, and about 3 degrees colder than the air in the room, which was already impressive given the July heat outside. The land belonged to my late husband. The land passed to me. My deed is registered and in order, and your offer, Mr. Prout, is not generous. It is an insult dressed in a suit. Prout's smile did not waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. There are legal complications to consider. A woman holding title alone in this territory is entirely within her rights under the statutes of 1872, she said, which I have read. Have you? The silence that followed was remarkable. Weston stood at the door with his deed in his hand, watching Prout recalibrate. He was careful not to grin, though it required some effort. This conversation is not finished, Prout said, and picked up his hat. It is for today, Petra said. Prout left without looking at Weston. Petra turned to Ogden the clerk, and Weston stepped forward to wait his turn, and that was when she glanced at him, briefly, the way people glance at strangers in a doorway, measuring and dismissing simultaneously. Except she did not quite dismiss him. She looked at him for perhaps half a second longer than was necessary, and then she looked away, and that was all. Weston registered his deed. He asked Ogden afterward, because he was a man who liked to have accurate information, who she was. Ogden told him about Thomas Raines, who had died of a fever 18 months ago. He told him about the 300 acres southwest of town, which had been producing cattle in modest but respectable numbers until Thomas died and everything got harder. He told him about the 2 ranch hands who had quit in the spring, citing unease about a woman boss, which Weston privately catalogued under the heading of cowardice. He told him that Petra Raines now ran the place with one hired man named Calvin, who was 62 and arthritic but loyal, and that she had not, in the year and a half since her husband's death, been seen to laugh, to flirt, to dance, or to participate in any of the small social rituals by which the people of Dusty Creek measured one another's wellness. She's not unfriendly exactly, Ogden said, in the thoughtful tone of a man searching for precision. She's more like a door that somebody nailed shut. Weston walked out into the July afternoon and thought about that, and then he went to find his 40 acres, and he did not think about Petra Raines again for almost a week. The 40 acres turned out to be decent land with a modest creek running along the north edge and soil that would support cattle if you were patient with it. The cabin on the property was small but solid, built by the previous owner with the intention of lasting, which Weston appreciated. He spent his first week repairing fences, taking stock of the water situation, and introducing himself to his neighbors, which in this part of New Mexico meant a ride of several miles in most directions before you found a soul. His westernmost fence line shared a border with the eastern edge of the Rains property. He discovered this on his 5th day, when he rode the perimeter of his land and came to a stretch of fence that needed replacing where someone had clearly borrowed his posts, and looked across the dry grass to where a woman on a chestnut horse was working her own fence line 100 yards away, coiling wire with the efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything themselves. He recognized the precise set of her shoulders. He did not call out to her. She was busy, and he had the sense that unexpected approaches from strange men would not be well received. He went back to his own work. But he became aware in the days that followed of the quiet geometry of their two properties existing side by side. He began to notice, in the early mornings when the air was still cool, the distant sound of her working, the way a gate would clang, the way Calvin, her elderly hired man, would call out instructions to the cattle in his rough, carrying voice, the way a lamp would come on in the ranch house before dawn, because she rose early, the way people rise early when sleep has become a complicated and often defeated effort. He brought her a fence post, not as a gesture of courtship or as an excuse to speak to her, simply because he had noticed, on his ride along their shared border, that her corner post was rotting at the base and would fail before the end of summer, and he had extra lumber, and it seemed wasteful to let a fence fail when it didn't have to. He rode over on a Wednesday morning with the new post balanced across his saddle and found Calvin in the yard mending a harness. "I have a post for the corner fence on your eastern line," Weston said. "The current one's rotting. Thought you might be able to use this." Calvin squinted at him with the ancient, measuring eyes of a man who had spent 60 years deciding who to trust. "You're the new man on the 40 acres, Weston Tanner." He dismounted and offered his hand. Calvin shook it carefully, his arthritic fingers working around the grip. "Calvin Marsh. You'd want to talk to Mrs. Rains about any work on the property." "I'm not looking to be paid," Weston said. "It's a neighbor's gesture, nothing more." Calvin studied him for another long moment, then tilted his chin toward the house. "She's inside. Go on and knock." She came to the door with a ledger book in her hand and a pen still held between two fingers, which suggested he had interrupted her accounts. She looked at him and then past him at the post balanced over his horse, and her expression moved through several calculations very quickly. "Weston Tanner," he said, "I have the 40 acres on your eastern border. Your corner post on that side is rotting out. I had extra lumber." "How much?" she said. "Nothing." She looked at him with those careful eyes, and he could see her deciding how to categorize this, what hidden motive to assign to it, because a woman in her position had learned that generosity without a visible price was usually generosity with a concealed one. "I don't accept charity," she said. "It's not charity, it's a fence post. If your fence fails, your cattle come onto my land. I'm being practical." A pause, very brief. "All right," she said. "Calvin can help you set it." She went back inside. He set the post with Calvin's help, and Calvin talked about the weather and the price of beef and the quality of the water in the creek. And Weston listened and responded, and was careful not to ask a single question about Petra Rains, because he knew enough about people to know that the appearance of disinterest was frequently the most honest form of respect. He rode home thinking that her eyes were the color of strong coffee, and that she held herself like someone who had survived something terrible and was not going to let it kill her, and that both of these things were more interesting than anything else he had encountered in a long time. The trouble with Gerald Prout escalated in the second week of Weston's residence in Dusty Creek. He heard about it first at the general store, where news in small towns circulates with the speed and accuracy of wildfire. Prute had hired a lawyer from Santa Fe, a man named Archie Dole, who specialized in what polite people called title disputes and what honest people called land theft. Dole had apparently found what he considered a technical irregularity in the paperwork surrounding Thomas Raines's original purchase of the 300 acres. Some question about whether a particular signature on a transfer document was properly witnessed. Whether the irregularity was real or manufactured was a question that people in Dusty Creek held varying opinions on, divided largely along the lines of whether they owed money to Prute's bank or not. Weston heard this in the store from the shopkeeper, a round, friendly man named Patterson, who framed it as neutral information and then watched Weston's face to see what he would do with it. "She know about it?" Weston asked. "Letter came yesterday," Patterson said, "from Dole's office. She came in for supplies this morning, and she had the look she gets when something bad's happened, but she's decided not to show it." Weston bought his supplies. He did not go directly to her ranch. He went home and thought about it, because he was not a man who acted impulsively, and he was aware that riding to a woman's door to offer unsolicited legal opinions was not necessarily a welcome thing. But he had, as a ranch hand in Texas, worked 2 seasons for a man who had himself faced a fraudulent title dispute. And in that process, Weston had learned more than the average cowhand about land law in the Western Territories, simply because he had read every document his employer had received and had sat in on the meetings and had absorbed through sheer attentiveness a working knowledge of how these challenges were typically structured and where their weaknesses lay. He went to see her the next morning. She received him on the porch this time, which felt like a small concession to continuity. He could see in her face the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent the night with a problem they could not solve. He told her what he knew about title dispute proceedings. He told her about the requirement for Dole to file his challenge within a specific window, about the importance of original documents versus copies, about the need to find any witnesses to the original transaction who were still living. He told her that the best defense was almost always to attack the process rather than the claim, because the process had rules and the rules could be used. She listened with absolute attention, the ledger book again in her hands but closed this time, as though she had come outside with it as a prop and then forgotten it. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "Worked for a man named Hargrove in Texas who faced the same kind of challenge. Watched the whole thing play out. And he kept his land, he did." She looked at him for a moment that stretched slightly beyond the functional, a moment where something behind those careful eyes was doing something other than calculating. "I'll need to find the original sale documents," she said. "Who witnessed them?" "A man named Edgar Foods. He was a land agent. I don't know if he's still in the territory." "I can make some inquiries," Weston said, "if you want." Another pause, shorter this time. "Why would you do that?" He thought about this honestly, because she deserved honesty and because he did not want to lie to her even through the mechanism of a half answer. "Because what Prute is doing is wrong," he said. "And because I'd rather have a neighbor than a bank agent on that land." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded, a single, precise nod that he understood to mean she had decided to trust him to this extent and not further, and that he should not mistake a concession for an invitation. "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Tanner." "Weston," he said. She considered this. Weston. He found Edgar Foods. It took him 4 days and a letter to the land agent registry in Santa Fe, and a response that came back with Foods's current address in a small town called Mira, which was 30 miles south. Weston rode out on a Thursday morning and came back Friday afternoon with a signed affidavit confirming that he, Edgar Foods, had witnessed and validated the original sale of 300 acres to Thomas Raines in June of 1878, that all signatures were genuine, that all parties had been present and of sound mind, and that he was prepared to appear in any legal proceeding to so attest. He brought the affidavit to Petra's ranch that Friday evening, just as the light was going golden and Calvin was letting the horses into the paddock for the night. She read the affidavit on the porch, standing, because she was not a woman who sat down to receive information that might require her to act immediately. He watched the tight line of her shoulders change as she read. Not much, but enough. "This is significant," she said. "It should shut Dole down before he gets anywhere near a hearing," Weston said. "You'll want to send a copy to the court in Santa Fe with a letter stating your intention to contest any challenge and CC Dole's office. Make it clear you're not going to be moved." She lowered the paper and looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, the expression on her face was not the careful, controlled mask, but something underneath it. Something that was tired and grateful and slightly bewildered. "You rode to Mira and back for this," she said. "I did." "Why?" Not suspicious this time. Genuinely asking. He opened his mouth and then closed it because the honest answer was one he did not yet have the right to give. So he gave her the second honest answer instead. "I don't like seeing people done wrong," he said. "Especially when they've already had a hard time of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and the evening light caught her face, and he saw something move across it that was not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite anything he had a name for. "Thank you," she said again, but differently this time. The first thank you had been formal. This one was from a place deeper down. He rode home in the gold and purple of a New Mexico summer evening, and felt something happening in him that he recognized, distantly, as the beginning of something he had not planned on. It was 2 days after that, when the thing in the saloon happened. He had gone in for a beer on a Saturday evening, because Saturday evenings in the West were for exactly that, and because he had spent the week in heavy labor, and his body was reminding him of this fact persistently. The Dusty Creek Saloon was a solid establishment run by a woman named Mabel Horton, who had the dimensions of a barrel and the will of a mountain, and who served no man more than he could handle without getting mean. The piano player, a young man named Jimmy, played well enough that it was a pleasure rather than a disturbance. Petra was there, which surprised him. She was sitting at a corner table with a woman he later learned was named Rosa Vargas, who ran the seamstress shop on the main street and had known Petra since before Thomas died. They were not drinking whiskey. They had coffee, which Mabel provided for those who wanted it, and they were talking in the low, continuous way of two people with enough history to not have to perform their friendship. He sat at the bar and was content to leave them alone. And then Rosa, evidently, said something. He did not hear what it was. He was looking at the mirror behind the bar, and he saw Petra's face in it. Saw Rosa lean forward with an expression that was conspiratorial and amused and whisper something. And he saw the corner of Petra's mouth move, and then the other corner, and then something broke open in her face like a morning breaking over a ridgeline, and she laughed. Real laughter, not polite amusement, not the careful chuckle of a woman maintaining social appearances. Real, unguarded, full-throated laughter that lasted 3 seconds and changed everything in the room, and then it stopped. And Weston, watching her face close back over that laughter like water closing over a stone, felt the decision crystallize in him so completely and so suddenly that it took his breath. He was never going to leave. He did not approach her that night. He was not a man who confused romantic intention with ownership, who believed that wanting something gave him the right to pursue it, regardless of the other person's state of readiness. She was a woman who had buried her husband 18 months ago and had since been fighting off a predatory banker and running 300 acres with one arthritic ranch hand, and had apparently not laughed since before Thomas died. And what she needed was not a man declaring his feelings at her in a saloon. What she needed was exactly what he could give without asking anything in return. A neighbor, a reliable presence, someone who showed up and helped and expected nothing. He left the saloon when the beer was finished and rode home under a sky so thick with stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across black cloth. And he thought about patience and proximity, and the long game, which he had always been better at than the short one. The Dole Challenge collapsed in the third week of August, exactly as Weston had predicted. The affidavit from Edgar Foods, combined with Petra's letter to the Santa Fe court and the unimpeachable state of her original deed documents, left Pruitt's lawyer with nothing to stand on. The letter of withdrawal came to the land registry office, and Ogden reported this to Patterson, who reported it to everyone who came into the general store, which in a town of 200 people meant the information was universal by noon. Pruitt was not gracious about it. He was seen coming out of the bank that afternoon with the look of a man who was revising his strategy rather than abandoning it. Weston noted this and stored it under the heading of ongoing concern. He went to tell Petra in person, because he thought she deserved to hear it from someone who was glad about it. She was in the horse paddock when he arrived, checking the hooves of a bay mare with the focused efficiency she brought to every task. She looked up when he came through the gate, and he told her, and he watched something release in her face. Not joy exactly. Relief. The kind of relief that comes after a sustained effort has finally succeeded, that lets down the muscles you have been holding tight for longer than you knew. "I'll write to Foods," she said, "to thank him. He was glad to help, said Thomas Raines was a good man." Something flickered through her face. She went back to the mare's hoof. "He was," she said quietly. Weston waited a moment, then said, "I should tell you, though. Pruitt doesn't look like a man who's finished." She was quiet for a moment. "No, I don't imagine he does. You should keep copies of everything. Store them somewhere other than the house if you can." She looked up at him over the horse's back. "You think he'd do something illegal?" "I think he's a man who wants what he wants," Weston said, "and who has enough money to cause trouble in several different directions." She held his gaze for a long moment, those dark eyes doing their complicated thinking. "All right," she said. "I'll make arrangements." He was about to turn and go when she said, "Weston." He turned back. "What you did," she said. "Riding to Mira, the affidavit, all of it." She paused, as though finding the right weight for words that were important enough to deserve the right weight. "I am not in the habit of depending on people. I have learned that it creates vulnerabilities, but what you did was significant, and I want you to know that I know that." "You would have found another way," he said. "I just made it faster." "Maybe," she said, "but you found him when I didn't know he existed. That matters." He nodded. He left. Riding home, he felt something warm settle in him that had nothing to do with the August sun. September brought the cooler air down from the mountains, and with it a change in the texture of things. The land went from gold brown to a more complex palette, the scrub oak beginning to turn, the mornings coming with a bite to them that made the lungs glad. Weston was deep into the work of establishing his ranch, had spent August building a proper stable and expanding the cabin's living quarters, and had managed to purchase a small starting herd of 8 cattle from a rancher to the north who was downsizing. He and Petra fell into a pattern that neither of them formally acknowledged. It began with the fence line. Their shared eastern border needed work in several places, and they both knew it. And one morning in early September, they both arrived at the fence from their respective sides at the same time with tools in hand. And after a moment of mutual assessment, they began working together without discussing it. They worked efficiently, in the way of people who are both competent and not inclined to waste breath on unnecessary conversation. They talked, but about practical things. The fence, the cattle, the water table, which was an ongoing concern on both properties as the dry season extended. The price of hay in town. The question of whether Patterson's new stock of wire was worth the premium he was asking for it. And then, gradually, other things. She told him about Thomas one afternoon in a way that felt like something she had decided to do rather than something that slipped out. She told him that Thomas had been a good man, steady and patient and hardworking, and that she had loved him in the way you love someone who is woven into your daily life, until the fabric of those days is inseparable from the presence of that person. She told him that when Thomas died, she had felt not just grief but a kind of fundamental disorientation, as though the ground had changed its nature underneath her feet. "I kept the ranch for him at first," she said, "because letting it go would have been like letting him go, and I wasn't ready. And then I kept it because I realized I was good at it, better than I knew." "You are," Weston said. "It's been a lesson in what I'm capable of," she said. "An expensive one. Most lessons are." She looked at him sideways. "What's yours been?" He thought about it honestly. "That working for other men's dreams eventually empties you out," he said. "You need something of your own to work toward, or the work just becomes repetition." She was quiet for a moment, coiling wire. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He noticed, in these fence-line conversations, that she asked him questions with genuine curiosity, not as social performance but because she actually wanted to know. She asked about Texas, about the ranches he had worked, about what had made him decide to come to New Mexico territory. She asked about his family, and he told her about his father, who had been a cattle drover and who had died when Weston was 19, leaving him without a blueprint, but with a work ethic that had never failed him. He asked her about herself in return carefully, the way you handle something that might be fragile in unexpected places. She had grown up in Missouri, she told him. Her father had been a school teacher, which explained the precision of her vocabulary, and the way she had cited the statutes of 1872 to prute without breaking stride. She had come west with Thomas when she was 22, following his vision of a cattle ranch in New Mexico territory, and she had been skeptical at first and then gradually convinced by the land itself, by its particular wild beauty, by the way the sky out here was larger and more honest than any sky she had ever seen in the green and crowded East. "Do you miss Missouri?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss trees, real trees with leaves. I miss the green of it." A pause. "But I belong here now, I know that. This land is mine in a way that Missouri never was." He watched her face as she said it and saw the truth of it in her eyes. October arrived and Prout made his second move. It came through a different mechanism this time. Not legal challenge but social pressure, which was, in its way, more insidious. Prout began a campaign of quiet, poisonous suggestion through the social networks of Dusty Creek, speaking at the town meetings at the bank, at the occasional dinner parties that the wealthier residents of the town used to perform their status, suggesting that a woman running a cattle ranch alone was a liability, that the land was being mismanaged, that Petra Raines was making decisions that were driving down the value of the surrounding properties. None of this was true. Weston knew it. Several other people in town knew it, but Prout had money and influence and the banker's particular skill of making things sound reasonable that were not. The effect was subtle but real. Two merchants who had extended Petra credit for supplies began to hesitate. A potential buyer for 20 of her cattle, a deal she had been working toward for weeks, withdrew without explanation. The texture of the town's interactions with her shifted by small degrees. Not open hostility, but a careful distance. The kind that leaves a person standing in public spaces feeling more alone than they would in an empty room. Weston watched this happen and felt something cold and deliberate settle in him. He went to the town meeting in October. These were monthly affairs, held in the schoolhouse, which was the largest public building in Dusty Creek. They were meant to address civic matters, but in practice, often became arenas for the exercise of Pruitt's considerable local power. He sat and listened to Pruitt, who was at his most polished and reasonable, suggest that perhaps the water rights along the creek that bordered the Rains property and 2 other properties to the south should be reconsidered given the ongoing drought concerns, a proposal that would conveniently disadvantage Petra's land significantly. When Pruitt finished, Weston stood up. He had not planned his words in advance, which was unusual for him. He spoke from the accurate knowledge he had gained in 3 months of living in Dusty Creek and working the land and paying attention. He said that the water rights being discussed had been established in 1879 and were legally binding, and that any attempt to revise them would require a territorial court proceeding that was unlikely to go in the direction Pruitt seemed to be anticipating. He said that the Rains property was well managed, and that he would know because his eastern fence line ran alongside her western border, and he watched how she worked every day. He said that the cattle market reports he had received from Santa Fe suggested that the decisions Petra had made about her herd were sound and demonstrated a clear understanding of current conditions. He said all of this in a level, factual voice that left very little room for objection without the objector looking either ignorant or dishonest. Then he sat down. There was a quiet that lasted several seconds. Pruitt looked at him with an expression that had nothing of a banker's smile in it, and everything of a man storing this moment for future use. Petra, who was sitting 3 rows ahead and to his left, did not turn around, but he saw her spine change. The exact vertebrae by vertebrae shift of a person who has just had someone stand behind them. After the meeting, outside in the cool October dark, she found him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I had relevant information," he said. "It seemed worth sharing." She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight from the schoolhouse windows, and her face was doing that complicated thing it did when she was letting something through from the carefully guarded interior. "Pruitt will come after you now," she said. "You've made yourself a target." "I have a properly registered deed and no debt to his bank," Weston said. "He doesn't have much of an angle. He'll find one," she said. "He's creative." "So am I," Weston said. She held his gaze. Then very quietly she said, "Thank you." "Petra," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the formality of her title, and he saw her register it. "You don't have to keep thanking me. I'm not keeping a tally." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it strange." He wanted to ask her what she meant by strange. But the moment shifted, other people coming out of the schoolhouse, and she said a brief, polite goodnight and walked to where Calvin was waiting with their horses, and Weston watched her go and thought about strange and what it meant coming from her. The cattle drive happened in November. Petra had negotiated a new sale, 25 head to a buyer in Albuquerque, a deal she had built carefully to replace the one Pruitt had poisoned. It was a 2-day drive south, which she and Calvin had done before, but Calvin's arthritis had been worsening in the cold, and the idea of him making the drive in November worried Weston more than he felt he had the standing to say. He offered to help. "It's a full 2 days of driving," she said. "I won't ask that of you." "You're not asking, I'm offering. You have your own cattle to manage. I've arranged for Patterson's boy to look in on them. He's reliable." She looked at him with an expression that was becoming familiar to him, the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to trust something. "All right," she said, "but I'm driving. It's my herd. Understood?" The drive was 2 days through the high desert country south of Dusty Creek, through landscape that was spectacular and indifferent, all red rock and distant mountains and sky that went on forever. They left before first light on a Tuesday morning, the cattle docile enough in the early cold, Calvin riding support from the rear while Weston worked the flanks and Petra led, reading the herd with the quiet authority of someone who knew these animals by name. The first day was hard work and not much conversation. The country demanded attention, and so did the cattle, and all three of them gave what was needed. The first night they made camp beside a shallow draw, tended the fire and ate beans and dried beef and drank coffee so strong it was almost solid. And the stars came out above the desert, and the cattle settled, and Calvin fell asleep against his saddle with the efficiency of a man who had been falling asleep in the open air for 60 years. And then it was Weston and Petra by the fire. She had let her hair down at some point in the evening, which was not something he had seen before. It fell to her shoulders, dark and slightly wavy from the coiling she kept it in, and in the firelight it was different from how she looked in town, softer around the edges, the guard not gone but less rigidly maintained. "You remember the first time we spoke?" she asked. It was a little surprising because she did not generally open conversations. She usually waited for him. "The land registry office," he said. "You were telling Prout the date of the 1872 statutes." The corner of her mouth moved. "You stood in the doorway the entire time." "I wasn't about to interrupt. Most men would have, I'm aware." She looked into the fire. "I noticed you," she said. "That day I noticed that you didn't interrupt. And then you went back inside," he said. "I had accounts to finish." "Of course you did." She glanced at him, and there it was again, the corner of the mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "What made you offer to help?" she asked. "The first time, the fence post." He thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind he could give her without it being a betrayal of some kind. "I saw someone getting done wrong," he said, "and I could help." And I had found, by that point in my life, that not helping when you can is something you carry with you in a way that isn't good. You could have just minded your own property. "I could have," he said, "but you were about to be my neighbor, and I prefer good neighbors." She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire shift. "Weston," she said, "I'm going to tell you something," she said, with the careful precision of someone measuring their steps onto uncertain ground. "And I'm telling you because I think you deserve to understand it, not because I'm asking anything of you." "All right," he waited. "When Thomas died," she said, "I stopped. In some fundamental way, I kept moving, I kept working, because the alternative was losing the land, and I couldn't allow that. But some part of me just stopped. I think people who knew me before can see it." She paused. "Rosa told me as much. She says I went quiet in a way that is different from just being a quiet person." "Rosa is perceptive," Weston said. "She is," Petra agreed. "And she's worried about me." A breath. "I'm telling you this because you keep helping me, and you keep asking nothing. And I need you to know that the reason I'm not different toward you is not that I'm ungrateful. It's that I have been operating for 18 months on the premise that the safest thing is to feel as little as possible. And breaking that habit is—" She searched for the word. "Disorienting." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark the cattle moved with their low, constant sounds. "I'm not in a hurry," Weston said. She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I have 40 acres and a building project and 8 cattle who need someone to be patient with them. I have no schedule." She held his gaze in the firelight, and he saw something in her face that was not the careful mask and not the guarded distance, but something underneath both of those things, something tentative and alive and slightly afraid of itself. "All right," she said quietly. "That's good to know." They let the fire burn low, and the conversation settle into silence that was comfortable, and eventually both of them slept. And the desert held them in its vast, indifferent dark, and the cattle breathed and the stars moved overhead. The drive completed without incident. The buyer in Albuquerque paid well, better than expected, and on the road back north Petra was different by small degrees, not transformed but lighter, the way a person is lighter when something that has been weighing on them has been resolved. She told him a story from Missouri as they rode, about a summer when she was 12, and her father had taken her and her brother on a fishing trip to a river whose name she had forgotten, and the fish had been entirely uninterested in being caught. But her father had read poetry aloud on the riverbank, and that had been the day she had fallen in love with language. It was the first purely happy memory she had shared with him, and he listened carefully and let it matter. December came down from the mountains with snow in it. The Dusty Creek winters were not the brutal affairs of the northern plains, but they were cold and occasionally fierce, and the work of the ranch adapted accordingly. Weston had finished his stable and was pleased with it, had increased his herd to 15 head, and had settled into the particular rhythm of a first-year rancher, which was a rhythm of problem-solving and physical labor, and the satisfaction of seeing something being built. He saw Petra regularly, sometimes at the fence line when both of them were working that boundary, sometimes in town when their errands overlapped, sometimes on a Sunday afternoon when she rode over on the chestnut horse with a practical question about water routing or a bit of information about the cattle market she thought would be useful to him. He understood that these visits had become something other than what they were framed as, and he understood further that she knew this too, and that she was approaching the knowledge the way you approach something you very much want, but have been burned by before, carefully, from a sideways angle, testing the ground before each step. Prout made his third move in December. It was more sophisticated than the previous two, and more dangerous, and it had been in preparation for longer than any of them realized. Prout had been quietly buying up the notes held against two small ranchers north of Dusty Creek, men who had borrowed from the bank and were struggling to repay in the drought year. By acquiring their notes, Prout had acquired leverage over their land, and in December he called in those notes simultaneously, knowing neither man could pay. Both ranchers were forced to surrender their property. What Prout's newly acquired land did, in combination with his existing holdings, was create a controlled corridor. The main water source feeding the creek that ran along Petra's northern border also fed through a section that now belonged to Prout's newly expanded property. It was not exactly a dam. It was a series of small engineering decisions, a channel redirected here, a berm built there that reduced the flow of water reaching her creek by enough to matter significantly. It was clever. It was the kind of harm that was difficult to prove and harder to prosecute. It was a forced choice. Either accept the reduced water and watch her cattle suffer through the winter, or accept whatever offer Prout chose to make. Weston figured it out in mid-December when he noticed the water level in the creek along their shared border was notably lower than it should have been given the recent snowfall. He rode the creek north and found the alterations. He came back and sat in the cold morning air on his horse for a long time, thinking it through. Then he rode to Petra's. She was already angry when he arrived, which meant she had noticed it herself. She was in the yard with Calvin, and her face had the particular controlled fury of a woman who has a great deal of it and is managing its expression very carefully. "I know," she said, when he told her what he had found. "He's counting on you not being able to prove it in time," Weston said. "By spring he thinks your herd will be under enough stress that you'll have to sell. He would have prepared for me going to the court. He would. The filings would take months and cost money you probably don't want to spend." She looked at him. "What would you do?" He had been thinking about this on the ride over. "Document everything," he said. "Photograph it if you can get access to a camera, get witnesses, and then I'd go around Prout entirely." "What does that mean?" "The Territorial Water Authority in Santa Fe," he said. "They have jurisdiction over waterway alterations that affect multiple landholders. This isn't just your creek, Petra. My property is downstream too, and the Garza family south of you. If we file together as a group of affected landholders rather than as a single complainant, we're a more compelling case and we bypass the local court entirely." She stared at him. "You knew about this," she said, "before this conversation." "I worked it out this morning," he said. "I came straight here." "The Garzas," she said. "Do you know them?" "I've met Diego Garza twice. He's a reasonable man." "He is," she said. "I'll go see him today." "Together?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment and something changed in her expression. Not the small changes he had been cataloging since August, the corner of the mouth, the slight softening around the eyes. This was larger. This was the expression of someone recognizing, with a clarity that could no longer be argued with or deferred, that they are not alone. "Yes," she said. "Together." They rode to the Garza ranch that afternoon, the three of them, because Calvin insisted on coming and nobody argued with Calvin when he used that tone. Diego Garza was a compact, serious man of 40 with a wife named Lucinda and 3 children, and he listened to what Weston laid out with the focused attention of someone who had been noticing the same problem and looking for exactly this conversation. He agreed immediately to join the filing. The complaint to the Territorial Water Authority went out on a Thursday, written by Weston in the careful, precise language of someone who had once spent 3 months reading legal documents over an employer's shoulder and had found it unexpectedly useful. They did not wait for Prout to react. The Water Authority response came faster than expected. In the middle of January, a letter from an inspector named Collins, who was being dispatched to investigate. Collins arrived on a gray mare with a ledger and a level, and spent 2 days measuring water flows and examining the alterations Prout had made. He was a meticulous man and unimpressible, and he documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that thoroughness was the only reliable weapon against people who had money and lawyers. Collins's report concluded that the water flow alterations were in violation of the Territorial Water Statutes of 1876, and that the party responsible was required to restore the original channel configurations within 60 days, or face significant financial penalty and potential criminal referral. Prout was required to undo everything he had done. The creek ran normally again by the 2nd week of February. Weston was at the fence line the morning the water came back to its proper level, doing some repair work in the cold, clear air, when he heard Petra's boots on the frozen ground and looked up. She was walking toward him from the direction of the creek bank, her breath coming in small white clouds, and her face was the face of someone for whom something very large has finally resolved. She stopped a few feet away. "It's back," she said. "I can see that," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the morning light was the pale winter kind that makes everything look clean and new. "He's not going to stop," she said. "You know that." "Probably not," Weston agreed. "But we've beaten him 3 times now. That's not nothing." "We," she said. He realized he had said it without thinking. "If that's presumptuous, no," she said, and the word was quick and firm. "No, it's right." She paused. "It's the right word." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the word we stood between them in the cold air like something that had always been true and had only now been spoken. He wanted to say something. He was working out what it should be when she said, "Weston, I need to tell you something else." "All right." She looked at the frozen ground for a moment and then at him. "You asked me once why I find your help strange," she said. "I said I'd think about it, and I have. And it's strange because I believed for a long time that the version of me who trusted people was gone," she said. "That I had given her up as a cost of staying practical and staying safe. And I find that she is not entirely gone. She just needed a reason to come back." He waited, because she was not finished. "And I find," she said very carefully, like someone placing something precious on a surface they are not certain will hold, "that you are the reason." The cold air between them was very still. "Petra," he said. "I am not asking anything," she said quickly. "I'm telling you something true. Because you have been honest with me from the beginning, and I owe you the same." "I'm not interested in what you owe me," he said. "I want to know what you want." She looked at him with those dark, complicated eyes. "I don't know how to want things yet," she said. "I'm relearning it. But I think I want," she stopped, started again. "I think I want time to find out what this is, carefully." "Carefully is my preferred speed," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm saying it to you and not someone else." He reached out and with great care and deliberateness took her hand. It was cold from the winter air. He held it without tightening, just held it, and she looked at their joined hands with an expression of someone who has not been touched like this in a long time and is finding, to their own surprise, that it does not frighten them. She did not pull away. They stood at the fence line in the February cold with the creek running freely behind them. And it was nothing like the grand romantic gestures of the novels her father used to read on those Missouri riverbanks. But it was real, and it was chosen, and that made it something the novels couldn't quite capture. Spring arrived the way spring arrives in New Mexico territory, not gently but decisively, the cold retreating overnight and the land erupting into its particular dry brilliance, the scrub going green at the tips, the wildflowers claiming the roadsides, the cattle growing lively and restless with the warmth. Weston and Petra had been, since February, something that neither of them had quite named, but that everyone in Dusty Creek had noticed and was discussing with the combined enthusiasm of a small community that had been watching two interesting people orbit each other for months, and was gratified to see them finally close the distance. Rosa Vargas, who had been Petra's closest friend and most reliable witness to all of it, told anyone who asked that it was about time, and then told Petra the same thing directly, which Petra received with the slightly exasperated affection of someone who knows their friend is right. Weston started taking Sunday meals at the ranch house. This was Petra's suggestion, offered with the practicality she deployed when she was doing something that felt emotionally significant but wanted to maintain the appearance of logistics. She had said, on a Wednesday in March, that it was inefficient for them both to be cooking separate meals on Sunday evenings when they spent most of the day working the same fence line anyway, and that Calvin would appreciate the company. He had agreed, solemnly, to the efficiency of it. The Sunday meals were simple. Beans and cornbread and whatever meat was available, coffee afterward, conversation that ranged across the entire map of two people discovering that their minds were remarkably compatible in the ways that mattered. They disagreed on things, which was also good. She thought he was too forgiving of people's failings. He thought she was too quick to decide a person's capacity was fixed. They argued these positions with the pleasure of two people who argue not to win, but to think. Calvin watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been around long enough to know what he is seeing. In April, Weston arrived for Sunday supper and found Petra on the porch laughing, not as she had laughed in the saloon. She was sitting on the porch steps with Rosa, who had apparently come for an afternoon visit. And whatever Rosa had said had caught Petra entirely off guard, and she was laughing with her head tipped back and her whole face open, and the sound of it went into Weston like sunlight. He stopped his horse at the gate and did not announce himself for a moment, because the sight of it was too good to interrupt. Rosa noticed him, and her eyes went bright with the delight of a woman who is witnessing exactly what she has been hoping for. Petra looked up and saw him, and the laughter faded but gently this time, not extinguished but simply coming to its natural end, and she looked at him standing there with his horse and his Sunday manners, and she did not put the mask back on. She smiled at him, not the corner of the mouth. A full smile, unhurried and unguarded. He dismounted and tied his horse and came up the path and said good evening to Rosa and Petra. And Petra said, "Rosa has been telling me about her disastrous attempts to teach Lucinda Garza to sew a buttonhole, which are funnier than they have any right to be." "They are genuinely catastrophic," Rosa confirmed with great dignity. They had supper, all of them including Calvin, and the conversation was easy and warm and punctuated by Rosa's stories, which were remarkable for their detail and their sense of the absurd. And more than once Petra laughed, and each time it was easier and more natural than the last, and Weston sat across the table from her, and thought that he had been right, in that saloon in July, and that being right had rarely felt so much like a gift. Fraught made one final attempt in May. It was the most direct and therefore the most revealing of his character. He came to Petra's ranch on a Thursday morning, unannounced, with his hat in his hand and his most reasonable expression deployed, and he offered her twice the market value for the 300 acres. She was civil. She let him speak. And then she said, clearly and without hedging, that she was not selling and that she would never sell to him, and that if he came to her property without an invitation again, she would consult with the territorial attorney about harassment, which, she said with the particular pleasure of someone who has done their reading, was a concept that had been formally established in the territorial statutes. Fraught left. He did not come back. It became apparent over the following weeks that he was redirecting his energies northward, toward a land opportunity in a different part of the territory, and that Dusty Creek was perhaps no longer as interesting to him as it had been when he believed Petra Raines could be pressured into selling. Without that prize, the calculations apparently no longer favored the effort. Whether justice had fully been served in all of this was a question Weston turned over honestly. Fraught had hurt people, the two ranchers who had lost their land to his note-calling scheme among them, and he would face nothing in the way of legal consequence for those actions, because the law in 1882 in the New Mexico Territory had very limited interest in the harm that could be done through financial mechanisms alone. It was an injustice that sat with Weston and with Petra and with the Garzas, who had discussed it at length, and the best answer any of them could arrive at was that they would be more vigilant, more organized, more connected to each other going forward, and that when someone like Fraught appeared in their community again, which history suggested he eventually would, they would be better prepared. It was not enough, but it was true. June arrived, warm and bright, and with it something Weston had been thinking about for several weeks. He had been considering how to say a particular thing. He was not a man who stumbled over words in ordinary conversation, but this was not ordinary conversation, and the difference between the right words and the wrong ones seemed to him to matter enormously. He asked Petra, on a Sunday evening in early June, to walk with him after supper. They walked out past the paddock and along the fence line in the long summer evening, when the light goes golden and reluctant, and the sky over the desert turns colors that do not have proper names. He had learned by this point that Petra thought better when she was moving, that walking unlocked something in her that sitting still kept under glass. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I can see it when you're building up to saying something important," she said. "You get a very particular look." "What kind of look?" "Like you're choosing the words as carefully as you'd choose lumber for a load-bearing wall." He laughed, which was unexpected enough that she looked at him with a pleased expression. "That's accurate," he said. They walked a few more steps in the golden light. "I love you," he said, simply. Without preamble or architecture, she was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said again. And then, in a different register, lower and more careful and more true, "I love you too. I have been aware of it for some time and have been deciding what to do about it. Have you reached a conclusion?" She stopped walking and turned to face him. The evening light was in her hair and on her face, and she looked exactly like the person she actually was, the one who had survived terrible things and rebuilt herself from the materials left behind, and who had not, in the end, given up on the possibility of being known. "I have," she said. "I'd like to stop being careful and start being something else." "What else?" "Happy," she said, as though it were a word she was remembering how to use. He put his hands on her face, gently, and she let him, and he kissed her in the June evening with the desert stretching out around them in every direction, and the fence line of two properties they had each built with their own hands standing nearby. And it was unhurried and real, and when it was done, she leaned her forehead against his, and let out a breath that sounded like the last of something being released. "There," she said quietly. "There," he agreed. They were married in September. The wedding was at the Dusty Creek Church, a small adobe building that served the community regardless of denomination, with the practical ecumenism of a place where the nearest alternatives were 40 miles in any direction. It was performed by a minister named Calloway, who had the good sense to keep his remarks brief and sincere. Rosa stood with Petra. Calvin stood with Weston, to the old man's visible emotion. Diego and Lucinda Garza were there, and Patterson from the general store, and Ogden from the land registry, and Mabel Horton from the saloon, and Jimmy the piano player, and a substantial portion of the 200 souls of Dusty Creek who had been watching this story unfold since July of the previous year and felt some proprietary investment in its conclusion. Petra wore a dress that Rosa had made from a bolt of blue silk Patterson had ordered from Santa Fe, and she wore her hair down because Weston had told her once that he liked it that way, and she had stored this information and chosen to use it today. She walked down the short aisle between the packed-in pews, and she looked at Weston standing at the front, and she felt the thing she had been rebuilding in herself complete its last circuit, come all the way closed, become whole. He looked at her the way he always had, with that straightforward, unashamed attention that had startled her the first time and had gradually become the thing she counted on most. And she thought that she would count on it for the rest of her life, and that this was not a frightening thought but a glad one. They said their vows in the simple, traditional form, because both of them were people who believed that the simple words were the right ones, that the old promises were old because they had been true long enough to last. And when Calloway said the part about "for as long as you both shall live," Weston looked at Petra, and she looked at him, and both of them understood that this was not merely a formal requirement but an actual statement of intent. The reception was in the street outside, because there was no building large enough for everyone who came, And Mabel provided drinks and Patterson provided food, and Jimmy played the piano through a window so it carried into the night air, and people danced in the September dust under a sky that was lit up with more stars than seemed possible. Weston danced with Petra 3 times. The third time he held her closer than was strictly necessary, and she allowed it, and they moved slowly in a small circle that paid no particular attention to the rhythm Jimmy was providing and did not care. "Last year," she said against his shoulder, "in July, I laughed in the saloon and then I was horrified because everyone was staring." "I remember," he said. "I found out later from Rosa what you did afterward." He pulled back slightly to look at her face. "What do you mean?" "She told me you set down your beer and didn't pick it up again," she said. "She said she had been watching you and you set it down, and you just looked at me with an expression she described as a man who had made up his mind about something permanent." He was quiet for a moment. "Rosa notices a great deal," he said. "She does," Petra agreed. "Was she right?" He looked at her in the lamplight of their wedding night, the woman who had been a door someone had nailed shut and who had opened, gradually, carefully, on her own terms, and was standing here now in a blue silk dress with her hair down and a gold ring on her finger. "Yes," he said. She was exactly right. Petra smiled at him, and the smile had none of the effort it had cost her 6 months ago. It was easy now. It was home. "Good," she said, and she put her head back on his shoulder and they danced. They merged the properties formally in October, which involved more paperwork than either of them had anticipated, and which Ogden at the land registry handled with his usual solemn enthusiasm. The combined 340 acres were registered under the name Tanner Ranch, though Petra kept the legal language careful enough that her original 300 acres remained traceable to its source, because she was a woman who believed in the importance of keeping records straight. The first winter they spent as a married couple was the kind of winter that tests whether people are right together, because there is nothing like genuine cold and enclosed quarters and the daily labor of shared survival to reveal whether two people's rhythms are compatible or whether they have made a beautiful mistake. They were compatible, more than compatible. They were good together in the way that things are good when they have been built correctly, when the foundations are properly laid and the materials are well matched, and the structure can bear the weight of actual weather. They argued sometimes, because both of them were people with opinions, and neither was inclined to abandon those opinions without cause. But they argued, as they always had, with the underlying premise that the other person was reasonable and worth persuading rather than defeating. Their arguments reached conclusions, sometimes his, sometimes hers, sometimes neither, which meant they had found a third position neither of them had started with. Calvin's arthritis got significantly worse that winter. He was 63 by then and had been, if he was honest, operating on stubbornness and loyalty rather than physical capacity for some time. Weston and Petra together hired 2 new ranch hands in the spring, a brother and sister named Marcus and Ellen Holt, who were 24 and 22 respectively, and who had come to New Mexico Territory from Kansas with exactly the same quality of ambition that Weston had carried from Texas. Calvin was not retired, because retiring Calvin against his will was an action with consequences none of them were willing to face. But his work shifted to the things he could do without putting excessive strain on his hands: the organization, the record-keeping, the advice, which he provided freely and accurately, and with the authority of someone whose institutional knowledge was irreplaceable. The first spring after their marriage, Petra told Weston she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with her usual directness, sitting across the table with her hands around a coffee cup and the morning light coming through the window. She told him, and then watched his face. His face did what she had never seen it do before, which was go completely unguarded in a way he could not have engineered if he had tried. He looked as though something he had wanted very badly and not allowed himself to think about in specific terms had suddenly become real. "Petra," he said, and his voice was different. "Yes," she said. "In November, I think." He came around the table and put his arms around her and held her with great care. And she let him, and she felt, in the simple, warm, solid fact of being held by him, that she had been right to choose life after all. That the long, difficult years that had brought her to this kitchen in this morning had been worth traveling. Their son was born in November, in the cold, clear air of a New Mexico autumn. Calvin held the lamp steady for 3 hours while Lucinda Garza, who had delivered her own 3 children and knew the business well, acted as midwife, and Rosa sat with Petra for all of it, holding her hand and talking her through the worst of it in a low, steady voice. Weston was outside because this was the arrangement, and he sat on the porch in the November cold and listened to the sounds from inside with the patient, focused anguish of a man who very much wants to be useful and has been correctly told that in this particular situation, the most useful thing he can do is stay out of the way. When Calvin opened the door and told him to come in, he went in, and Lucinda put the baby in his arms, and he stood there holding a person so new and so complete, and so entirely astonishing that he did not have any words at all for a long time. The baby had dark hair like Petra and dark eyes that would take months to settle into their eventual color. He had a good grip, which Weston tested and which the baby demonstrated with vigor. "He's healthy," Lucinda said, and Petra did beautifully. Petra was lying in the bed with the exhausted, radiant, somewhat incredulous expression of someone who has just done the most extraordinary thing of their lives and is still catching up to the fact of it. Weston brought the baby to her and sat on the edge of the bed, and she took the baby and looked at him with that specific wonder, and then she looked at Weston and she said, "Henry." They had talked about names. Henry had been her father's name. "Henry," Weston agreed. Calvin from the doorway said, "Fine name," with the gruff approval of a man who has been waiting a long time for something like this and is gratified it has arrived. Rosa stayed for supper. Lucinda stayed for supper. The November cold settled over the ranch and the oil lamps burned warmly, and Henry Thomas Tanner slept in the small crib that Weston had built in August with the careful precision of a man who wanted to make sure it would last. And the adults sat around the kitchen table and talked about everything and nothing, about the ranch and the winter coming and what spring would look like. And outside the stars came out over the desert in their uncountable thousands. 2 years after Henry was born, they had a daughter, and they named her Clara after Weston's mother, and she arrived in July with a full set of opinions about the world that she expressed continuously from her first moments, and showed no sign of moderating as she grew. She had Weston's eyes, that creek watercolor between green and brown, and her mother's precision of expression, which was a combination that would serve her well. The ranch grew. Marcus and Ellen Holt proved themselves over and over, and Weston promoted Marcus to head hand within 2 years and raised both their wages without being asked, because he had spent his own youth being paid exactly what his labor was worth, and had found the experience clarifying. He had promised himself, when he had his own land, that the people who worked it would be treated with the dignity that had not always been extended to him, and he kept that promise. The cattle herd expanded to 80 head by 1886, which was respectable for a ranch of their acreage, and represented the sustained effort of 4 years of careful breeding decisions and market judgment. Petra's instincts in these matters were consistently good. She had a particular gift for understanding the market cycles, for knowing when to sell and when to hold, which had perhaps developed from her father's teaching or perhaps was simply native to her, and Weston was not too proud to defer to it. The drought of 1886 was hard. Hard on everyone in the territory, and the Tanner Ranch was not exempt. They lost 8 head that summer and had to buy hay at punishing prices, and the creek ran low again, though this time the problem was the weather rather than fruit. They made the decisions that hard times require, carefully and together, and they came through it leaner than they had gone in but intact, both the ranch and themselves. If anything, the difficulty of that year deepened something between them. They had been married 4 years by then, and they knew each other in the comprehensive way that only comes from time and shared trial, and that knowledge was a foundation that held under pressure. Calvin died in the spring of 1887, quietly, in the small room off the back of the bunkhouse where he had slept for 14 years. He died in his sleep, which was, as Rosa said at the small funeral service they held for him on the ranch, exactly the right ending for a man who had spent his days in hard and honest labor, and who had never complained about any of it. He was buried on the ranch, because he had no family elsewhere and the ranch was the right place for him. And Weston built the marker himself and spent more care on it than he had expected to, because Calvin had been the first person in Dusty Creek to trust him enough to send him to knock on Petra's door, and that was a debt worth marking. Henry was 5 when Calvin died and asked questions about death with the thoroughness of a 5-year-old, which required answers. Petra gave them honestly and carefully, in the tradition of her schoolteacher father, who had believed that children deserved truthful answers delivered at the appropriate level of complexity. Weston listened to how she did it and learned from it, and applied the lesson to Clara 2 years later when the ranch dog died, and Clara required the same conversation. They were good parents, which is not a given and which they both knew was not a given, and which they therefore did not take for granted. They worked at it with the same deliberate attention they brought to the ranch and to each other. The summer of 1888 was the summer Henry decided to teach himself to ride properly, which he was old enough to do, and which involved a significant number of falls that he regarded as purely informational, an attitude he had apparently inherited from both parents. Clara, at 3, watched this process with intense interest and demanded equal treatment, which she would have to wait for, and expressed this injustice loudly. Weston watched his daughter assert her position on this matter one evening from the porch, and felt something so full in his chest that it almost hurt. Petra came and stood beside him, and they both watched Clara make her case to Marcus, who was absorbing it with admirable seriousness. "She's going to be someone," Petra said. "She already is someone," Weston said. Petra leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the summer evening watching their children and their ranch hand and their cattle in the golden light. "Weston," she said. "Mm. Do you remember what you said to me once? That working for other men's dreams eventually empties you out, I remember. I want you to know," she said, "that this is my dream, not what I fell into by surviving Thomas's death, not what I held onto out of stubbornness. This." She gestured, small and precise, at all of it. The ranch, the children, the evening light, him. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He turned and looked at her face, which he had been looking at for 6 years now and which still, on a regular basis, surprised him with what it contained. "From the day I set the fence post," he said, "I knew." She smiled at him, and it was the smile she had given him at the wedding, easy and unhurried and home. In the autumn of 1889, New Mexico moved a step closer toward statehood, which was a process that would take another 20 years, but which generated considerable political energy in the territory, and brought with it changes to land registration law that actually strengthened the position of existing deed holders, which meant that the 340 acres of Tanner Ranch were more secure than they had ever been. Petra read the new statutes from beginning to end, as she read everything, and reported the relevant passages to Weston over breakfast with the satisfaction of someone who has always been right about the importance of knowing the law, and has once again been proven correct. "You sound pleased," he said. "I am pleased," she said. "The 1872 statutes were good. These are better." Henry, sitting across from them with his oatmeal, said, "What's a statute?" With his mouth full, and the next 20 minutes of breakfast were instructional, which was entirely normal in that kitchen on that ranch in those years. They had one more child, a boy, born in 1891, whom they named James after no one in particular, simply because it was a good name, and he looked like a James from the moment he arrived. He had Weston's dark hair and Petra's precise quality of attention, and he demonstrated from infancy an interest in mechanical things that would, in later years, lead him to become the first person in the family to understand the significance of the coming age of engines. But that was a story for another decade. The year James was born, Rosa Vargas finally, after considerable deliberation, accepted the proposal of a widowed carpenter named Seth, who had come to Dusty Creek from Colorado, and who was the first man, as Rosa explained to Petra in considerable detail, who had ever made her feel both interesting and comfortable simultaneously, which she had not previously believed was possible in a single person. The wedding was in June. Petra was Rosa's witness, which was the correct and only possible arrangement, and she wore the blue silk dress that Rosa had made for her own wedding 9 years earlier, because it still fit, because Petra Tanner was a woman who took care of things. Weston danced with Petra at Rosa's wedding in the same June evening light that had been present at their own, and they moved through it with the ease of people who have been dancing together for years and know exactly how the other person moves. "You remember the saloon?" she asked. "July 1882, he said. I laughed, and then I was mortified, and then I looked out the window and pretended I hadn't. "I know, I was watching." She looked up at him. "What were you thinking?" He considered this. "I was thinking that whatever had happened to make you stop laughing was something that should not have happened," he said, "and that the sound of it was the best thing I had heard in a long time, and that I was going to stay." She held his gaze. "Just like that," she said. "You hadn't even spoken to me." "I know," he said. "Some things are clear before you have the evidence for them." She was quiet for a moment, moving with him in the dance. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "I know," he said. "I told you I would." She smiled, and the smile went all the way up to her eyes, those dark, complicated, beautiful eyes that he had been reading for 9 years and was still not finished learning. "Yes," she said. "You did." The Tanner Ranch persisted and grew through the years that followed, through the changes that came to the New Mexico territory, as the 19th century moved toward its end, and the West changed its nature gradually from the wild, ungoverned place it had been into something more settled and complicated. The cattle market had its cycles, and they navigated them. The weather had its extremes, and they endured them. The community of Dusty Creek grew and changed, new people arriving, old ones departing, the small dramas of close-knit human proximity unfolding in their perpetual rhythms. Prout eventually moved his operations entirely out of the territory. Nobody missed him. Ogden at the land registry retired after 20 years in that overheated room and was replaced by a young woman from Santa Fe who reorganized the filing system and was regarded with initial suspicion and eventual profound gratitude. Patterson's General Store passed to his son, who expanded the stock and introduced a postal service arrangement that meant people no longer had to ride to the next town for mail. The children of Dusty Creek grew up alongside Henry and Clara and James Tanner, and the relationships formed in those schoolroom years and those ranch fence summer days were the kind that last, the kind that form the connective tissue of a community's memory. Henry became a rancher, as expected, and took on significant responsibility for the ranch operations in his late teens with a natural authority that his parents recognized as both of them distilled into a single person. He was steady and perceptive and occasionally too serious, which Weston tried to address by telling him stories from his own youth, and which Petra addressed by making him sit with Clara for an hour each day, on the grounds that it was impossible to be too serious in the continuous presence of Clara. Clara grew up exactly as Petra had predicted into someone, a person of such vivid particular presence, that the town simply organized itself slightly around her. She was her mother's daughter in the precision of her thinking, and her father's daughter in the directness of her speech, and her own particular self in the energy she brought to every room she entered. James grew up quieter and more interior than the other two, a boy who took things apart to understand them and who asked questions that went sideways in unexpected directions, and who would turn out in time to be the most remarkable of them in ways that none of them anticipated in his childhood. Weston and Petra Tanner grew older on their land with the specific grace of people who have built their lives correctly and know it. Not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ordinary human griefs that come to everyone regardless of the life they have built, but with the bedrock of each other, which held. There was a morning, some years after James was born, when Weston woke before dawn in the way he had always woken, the habit of ranching having set his internal clock to a time before the sun, and lay for a moment listening to the desert quiet and the distant cattle and the breathing of the woman beside him. She was awake, too. She often was in these early hours. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The spring pasture," she said. "I want to move the herd earlier this year. The grass comes faster when we've had a wet winter." It was a wet winter, he agreed, so we should move them earlier. "All right," a quiet moment. "And I was thinking," she said in a different register, "about July 1882. He turned his head to look at her in the dark. "Again," he said, amused. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "About who I was then. About what I had lost and didn't know I could find again, a breath. About how close it was, how easily you could have not been there." "I was there," he said. "You were there," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad I laughed, even though I was horrified. I'm glad that it happened and that you heard it." He reached across and found her hand in the dark. "So am I," he said. She held his hand in the dark of the New Mexico morning, with the ranch surrounding them and the children sleeping in their rooms and the cattle in their pastures, and the creek running along the northern border with its steady, faithful voice, and the desert holding all of it in its vast, indifferent, occasionally beautiful hands. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift from black to a very dark blue at the eastern edge, the first suggestion of a day that would arrive with the same determination that all days arrived, regardless of whether you were ready. "Weston," she said. I love you." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not something he had done when they first married, and was something he did now without thinking. The way you do things that have become part of the fabric of who you are. "I love you," he said. Outside, the sky went from very dark blue to the deep purple that comes just before the first light, and the ranch held its breath in that particular stillness that belongs only to the moments before dawn, And Weston and Petra Tanner lay in the dark of their house on their 340 acres and held each other's hand. And they were, in the true and complete sense of the word, home. The morning came as it always did, certain and unhurried, spreading its clean light across the desert and the grass, and the cattle and the fence lines that ran between properties that had once been separate and were now one. The creek caught the light and carried it south. The horses moved in the paddock, restless and glad for the new day. The ranch house stood solid on its ground, the ground that was theirs, registered and documented and legally unassailable, and entirely, permanently, theirs. Henry came out first, as he always did, ready for work with his father's early rising habit and his mother's organized purpose. And life on the Tanner ranch began again, for another day, on the same good ground where it had always been, solid and real and built to last.